Lucille Ball was halfway through a filming day at Devorcrd Studios when the divorce papers were finalized. The news reached the set the way news always reaches a working soundstage, quietly, through assistants and production coordinators, until everyone knew and no one said anything. What happened in the hour that followed, with an 8-year-old girl who wasn't supposed to be there and a maintenance electrician who couldn't find childcare that morning, is a story that begins with the collapse of a marriage and ends somewhere nobody on that set expected. It was Thursday, March 1960. Stage 9 at Devorcrd Studios in Hollywood was running the kind of production day that sitcom filming requires when you're shooting in front of a live studio audience. The crew had been there since 6 o'clock in the morning. Lucille Ball had arrived at 7:15, been through hair and makeup by 8:30, and was on set for blocking rehearsal by 9. The rehearsal went poorly, not because of technical problems or script issues, but because Lucille Ball, who had built a career on precision timing and absolute professional focus, could not remember her marks. She had walked through the same scene 4 times and stopped in the wrong place every time. The director, a man named Jerry Thorpe, who had worked with her for 2 seasons and knew her rhythms, called a break at 10:15. In her dressing room, Lucille Ball sat facing the mirror, looking at her reflection in the particular way a person looks at themselves when they are trying to find something familiar and cannot locate it. The makeup was right, the hair was right, the costume was period perfect for the scene they were shooting, everything was in place except the person wearing it. The phone call had come at 9:47. Her lawyer, brief and professional, confirming what she had known was coming for 6 weeks, but had not fully accepted until she heard the words said aloud in legal language. The divorce from Desi Arnaz was finalized. 20 years of marriage, 2 children, a production company that had changed television, and a partnership that had been as much a business as it was a relationship. All of it formally ended in a 3-minute phone call between takes on a Thursday morning. She had thanked the lawyer. She had hung up the phone. She had walked back to the set and tried to remember where she was supposed to stand for a scene about a misunderstanding with a neighbor that was written to be funny. She could not remember. She could not make herself care about remembering. Jerry Thorpe found her in the dressing room at 10:30. He knocked twice, waited for permission that didn't come, and opened the door anyway. Lucille was sitting in the makeup chair with her hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing in particular. "We can postpone," Jerry said. "We can push the shoot to next week." Lucille shook her head. "No. We have an audience coming at 7 o'clock. We have sponsors who paid for this episode. We're filming today." Jerry looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has worked in television long enough to know when someone is holding themselves together through sheer professional will and when that will is about to run out. "Lucy," he said, using the name everyone used, "you don't have to do this today." "Yes, I do," she said. She stood up. She straightened her costume. She walked past him and back onto the set. The electrician's name was Frank Castellano. He was 52 years old, had worked at Devorcrd for 11 years, and was responsible for the lighting grid on Stage 9. He was also, on that particular Thursday, responsible for his daughter Elena, who was 8 years old and supposed to be at school, except that she had woken up that morning with what might have been a fever or might have been nothing, and Frank's wife was already at work, and there was no one else to watch her. Frank had called the school. He had called his wife. He had run out of options by 7:30, and had made the decision that working parents make when the system they have built to manage their lives breaks down. He brought Elena to work. She was sitting in the equipment room off Stage 9, a small windowless space filled with spare bulbs and cable spools and the particular smell of electrical components and old coffee. Frank had given her a book and a sandwich and instructions to stay quiet and not touch anything. Elena was a good kid. She stayed quiet. She read her book. She ate her sandwich. At 11 o'clock, Frank needed to adjust one of the key lights on the main set. He told Elena to stay in the equipment room. He was gone for 7 minutes. When he came back, Elena was not there. He found her 30 seconds later, standing at the edge of the soundstage, watching Lucille Ball rehearse. Elena had somehow gotten past the production assistants and the stage manager and was standing just outside the lit area, completely still, watching with the unblinking attention that children give to things that fascinate them completely. Frank crossed the stage quickly, trying not to draw attention. He reached Elena just as Lucille Ball stopped mid-scene, looked directly at the small girl standing in the shadows, and froze. The set went quiet. Jerry Thorpe looked up from his script. The other actors, Mark Carlin and Vivian Vance, stopped where they were. The crew, who had been moving through the practiced choreography of a working soundstage, all stopped and looked at the same thing Lucille was looking at. Elena Castellano, 8 years old, wearing a yellow dress and holding a stuffed rabbit, was staring at Lucille Ball with an expression of pure joy. Frank Castellano reached his daughter. "Elena," he said quietly, "you need to come back with me." Elena didn't move. She was still looking at Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball was still looking at her. And then Elena did something that Frank Castellano would remember for the rest of his life and would describe to his wife that evening with the specific bewilderment of a parent watching their child do something completely unexpected. She ran toward Lucille Ball. She crossed the lit set in 4 seconds, her shoes making small sounds on the polished floor, the stuffed rabbit in one hand, and she reached Lucille Ball and threw her arms around her waist and said with absolute certainty and no hesitation, "I love you so much." Lucille Ball stood completely still. Her arms were at her sides. Her face had the expression of someone who has been moving through a day on muscle memory and has just been pulled out of it by something they weren't prepared for. Frank Castellano was already moving toward them. "I'm so sorry," he said. Elena let go. "I'm sorry, Miss Ball. She wasn't supposed to be here. I'll take her back." "Wait," Lucille Ball said. Frank stopped. Lucille Ball looked down at the small girl holding onto her. Elena looked up at her with the uncomplicated adoration of a child who has just met someone they have loved from a distance and discovered they are real. Lucille Ball knelt down. She knelt on the soundstage floor in her house dress and apron, the costume she'd worn for 9 years, the costume that made her one of the most famous women in America. She looked at Elena at eye level. "What's your name?" "Elena." "That's a beautiful name." Her voice was steady, but something in it wasn't, something the crew could hear but couldn't name. "I watch you every Monday. You're the funniest person I've ever seen." Lucille Ball looked at this 8-year-old girl telling her she was funny on the same day her marriage had legally ended, and her professional focus had completely abandoned her. She looked at Elena, and something in her face changed. She started crying. Not dramatically, not the way actors cry on cue, but in the quiet, helpless way people cry when something held together stops holding. Elena looked worried. "Are you sad?" "Yes, I'm very sad today." "Why?" Lucille paused. "Because something in my life ended today, something very important." Elena thought about this. Then she hugged Lucille Ball again, tighter, and said, "But you're still funny. That didn't end." Lucille Ball put her arms around Elena Castellano and held her. The soundstage went completely silent. 50 crew members, 3 actors, 1 director, and 1 worried electrician stood absolutely still and watched Lucille Ball kneel on the floor of stage 9 and cry into the shoulder of an 8-year-old girl who wasn't supposed to be there. Almost a minute passed. Then Lucille pulled back, wiped her eyes, looked at Elena. "Thank you. I needed that." "You're welcome," Elena said seriously. Lucille stood up. She looked at Frank Castellano, who had the expression of a man trying to apologize and thank someone simultaneously. "What's your name?" "Frank Castellano, Miss Ball. Key electrician. I'm so sorry. She wasn't supposed to." "Where's her mother?" Frank hesitated. "At work. Elena had a fever this morning, or we thought she did. I couldn't find anyone to watch her, so I brought her with me. It won't happen again." Lucille looked at him, then at Jerry Thorpe, who stood with his script, watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone witnessing something they don't yet understand. "Jerry, can we take an early lunch?" Jerry checked his watch. 11:20. "Yes." "Good." Lucille looked at Elena. "Have you had lunch yet?" Elena shook her head. "Would you like to have lunch with me?" Elena looked at her father. Frank looked at Lucille Ball. Lucille looked back with an expression that was somehow both a question and not a question at all. "Yes," Frank said, "if that's all right." "It's all right." They had lunch in Lucille's dressing room. Catering brought sandwiches, fruit, 2 sodas. Lucille Ball and Elena Castellano sat across from each other and talked. They talked about school, about Elena's stuffed rabbit, Mr. Buttons, about I Love Lucy, which Elena watched every week with her family and said was the best show on television, even though her brother preferred The Lone Ranger. Lucille asked Elena's favorite episode. Elena thought seriously and said the one where Lucy got stuck in the freezer. Lucille laughed, the first real laugh all day, and said that was one of her favorites too, because it had been very cold to film. They talked for 40 minutes. Frank waited outside in the hallway, hands in his pockets, occasionally checked on by crew members asking if everything was all right. Frank said everything was fine. At 12:05, the door opened. Lucille Ball and Elena came out together. Elena was holding Lucille's hand. "Thank you for lunch," Elena said. "Thank you for the company." Lucille looked at Frank. "She's a wonderful kid." "Thank you." Lucille knelt down one more time. "Can I tell you something?" "Yes." "Today was a very hard day for me. One of the hardest days I've had in a long time. And you made it better. Do you understand that?" Elena nodded seriously. "Good. Thank you for that." She hugged Elena one more time, stood up, and walked back onto the set. The afternoon filming went smoothly. Lucille Ball remembered her marks, hit her timing, made the crew laugh. When the studio audience arrived at 7 o'clock that evening, she performed with the energy and precision that had made her one of the most reliable performers in television. Nobody watching the finished episode 3 weeks later would have known it was filmed the day Lucille Ball's divorce was finalized. The work was the work, and the work was done correctly. Frank took Elena home at 6 o'clock. In the car, Elena asked if Miss Ball was going to be okay. Frank thought about how to answer. "I think so. I think she's going to be fine." "Good," Elena said. "She's very nice." "Yes, she is." 3 days later, a package arrived at Frank's home. Inside was a signed photograph of Lucille Ball dedicated to Elena and a handwritten note on Devorcrd Studios stationery. The note said, "Dear Elena, thank you for reminding me what matters. You have a kind heart. Don't ever lose it. With love, Lucy." Frank framed the photograph. It hung in Elena's bedroom until she left for college in 1970 and hangs in her living room now, 64 years later, in the Pasadena house where she's lived for 30 years. Elena Castellano Moretti is 72 years old. She's told the story many times to her children, to her students during 35 years teaching elementary school, to anyone who asks about the photograph on her wall. She tells it the same way every time, her father bringing her to work, seeing Lucille Ball on set and not being able to help herself, running toward her, hugging her, telling her she loved her. And then what happened next? Lucille Ball kneeling down and crying and thanking her. Elena always pauses at the same place in the story. She was sad, sadder than I understood at the time. But when she looked at me, something changed. I don't know what it was. I was just a kid who loved her show. But it meant something to her that day. She pauses again, the way people pause before saying the part that matters most. Sometimes the smallest thing you do for someone is the biggest thing they needed. I didn't know that when I was 8. But I know it now. Frank Castellano worked at Devorcrd Studios until 1967. He never spoke about that day outside his family. When people asked what Lucille Ball was like to work with, he said she was professional and kind, which was true, and left it at that.